The Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 9th chapter. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of Jesus' face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, they saw 2 men, Moses and Elijah, talking to Jesus. They appeared in glory and were speaking of Jesus' departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep. But since they had stayed awake, they saw Jesus' glory and the 2 men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things that they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met Jesus. Just then a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you, look at my son. He's my only child." Suddenly a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." And while he was coming, the demon dashed the boy to the ground in convulsions, but Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And all were astounded at the greatness of God. This is the gospel of the Lord. Be seated. The Lord be with you. That is a greeting to which we all as Lutherans have a Pavlovian response. Pavlov's dog, you might remember. And so the Lord be with you and also with you. And it's a greeting that we share with each other on Sundays. It's how we begin communion with that phrase, and it's also an invitation to prayer. In fact, every Wednesday night at the close of confirmation class, we gather in a circle, we clasp hands, and then whoever is going to pray begins with those words, "The Lord be with you," and it centers all of our attention towards the prayer. It's so ingrained, so automatic. Yet, I wonder, how often do we stop to think about what that phrase really means when we're saying it? The Lord be with you. Do we consider the power that's behind those words? When we say the Lord be with you, what we're asking is that the fullness of Jesus, his cross, his resurrection, all the things that we know Jesus to be, grace, love, peace, hope, life, that all those things will be with you. And then the response of the person receiving that greeting is yes. All that stuff, Jesus, the cross, the resurrection, the fullness of all that Jesus is, be with you too. That's indeed a powerful greeting that we as Christians exchange with one another. It's a little bit more than a hi, how you doing? Asking and expecting in that greeting that everything that Jesus is will be present right here, right now, within our meeting, our gathering together, and will be with each one of us individually too. Wanting that for one another, hoping in that for one another. The Lord be with you. When we think about what those words mean, then, that can transform how we see that moment in which we greet one another. We become aware, we see the holy and the sacred that's contained in our meeting, in the exchange of that well-worn phrase, that's been said disciple to disciple, beloved child to beloved child, century after century. So in our gospel reading today, we hear the story of what is often called, as I shared with the kids, Transfiguration of Jesus. And Jesus is transfigured on that mountaintop, and the fullness of him is revealed to the 3 disciples who were there. And it's a fitting end to our season of Epiphany, this season of light and this season of revelation. Peter, James, and John see this terrifying change in Jesus. His face changed in the brightness, his clothing becoming dazzling white. And then there with Jesus appears Moses and Elijah, the 2 greatest figures from the history of Israel. One who God chose to lead God's people out of slavery in Egypt, and the other, the Lord's great prophet who healed people and performed miracles. Well, as terrified as he is, Peter manages to grasp the awe and the majesty of this moment. And Peter declares that this gathering is good. So good, in fact, that he wants to keep it, to preserve it, to enshrine it by making 3 dwelling places. One for Moses, one for Elijah, and one for Jesus. Oh, poor Peter. He's a bit flustered, to say the least. Always the first one to speak and act. But the moment is not meant to last. Moments don't last. They move on. And so this moment does pass as moments will, but then there's a new moment right behind it. And it carries with it something just as awe-inspiring. A cloud that moves in over the mountain and overshadows the group. And that cloud is a moment of grace. That shadow, a break, a respite, a bit of relief from all that terrifying brightness. And then from that shadowing cloud, a voice proclaiming Jesus as the Son, the chosen one, commanding that the disciples listen to him. When all is suddenly quiet, Peter, James, and John look around. The transfiguration has ended. No Moses, no Elijah, no dazzling light. Now it's just Jesus, only Jesus, their rabbi, their teacher, their friend. And Peter, James, and John now follow only Jesus down the mountain, back to the mission at hand, back to healing and casting out demons and demonstrating the greatness of God. And so I wonder if perhaps the story hasn't been misnamed after all these years. It's maybe not the transfiguration of Jesus, but a transfiguration for the disciples. Jesus being transfigured or transformed, not as much as the sight, the vision, the understanding of those disciples being transformed. I mean, Jesus, whether we see it or not, always looks that way. He's the one who came to be light for this world that has so much darkness in it. He is always so dazzling and so bright. The disciples saw Jesus in that mountaintop moment as he truly is, as he always is. And it was their eyes, their sight, their lives that experienced the transfiguration. But as we saw, it really just couldn't be for that moment. But no, the memory of that image still managed to be burned into their vision. Like when we go out into the brightness of the sun and we can close our eyes and we still see that spot of the sun in our eyelids. As much as he wanted to, Peter could not capture that moment, but he could not enshrine it and he could not make time stand still. But neither could he or James or John ever forget that moment. The dazzling Jesus, and never could they go back to how they saw the world before they had seen Jesus in his fullness of being. The Lord be with you. Jesus be with you. The fullness of all that Jesus is, bright and dazzling and even a little terrifying. Terrifying? Yes, terrifying. Because when I realize that Jesus is with me, or you realize that Jesus was with you, truly with us, then that's terrifying. Because if I'm truly seeing Jesus, then Jesus is seeing me. And I wonder what he sees. Does he see a disappointment, a failure, a sinner? And thankfully, no. By God's grace, through the waters of baptism, Jesus looks at us, at all of you, and he sees his light reflected back. Jesus looks at us and sees God's beloved. Jesus looks at all four of you and sees you as his beloved. Jesus is our transfiguration. Jesus is the bright and dazzling one who comes to go back down the mountain and to show himself as he truly is, but this time on the cross. Jesus isn't transfigured in our sight, but our sight is transfigured through Jesus. And in baptism, we see who God has made us to be, God's beloved. And then we're called to see this vision of transfiguration for the whole world. To see the greatness of God that's near to us, living within us, and then to see God in one another. So the first Sunday of Epiphany, we began with the baptism of Jesus, the revealing of the Son, the beloved, and the voice we heard at the Jordan River that day is the same voice we hear on the mountaintop. The Transfiguration is a baptismal moment. It's a moment of ongoing change. It's an event of continual transformation. So the brightness does get overshadowed. The water dries off. But the grace of God and the mark of our identity as God's beloved continues. So Faith and Natalie and Aaron and Lydia, on this day of affirming your baptism, you're affirming the way that Jesus has transfigured your lives. And this is a mountaintop moment. You're surrounded by your faith community. You're stepping forward as committed disciples. You're praying for God's help and guidance all along your path. But this mountaintop moment won't last. The feeling of awe and joy will fade. It'll fade as you go back down the mountain, back on down to all the everyday stuff that you have to attend to. We don't spend our lives on the mountain. More often, we're down in the valley. And there, things aren't always so dazzling. There, the brilliance does dim. It does get overshadowed. And there are broken people and circumstances that need healing. And there are demons that need casting out. And there are crosses that we carry. The moment on the mountain passes, but the transfiguration that God is working in your life continues on. And home in the valley, when you see the same old things, you'll see them in a different light. And when you close your eyes, you can still see that after image of Jesus. And you can still hear the voice saying, "This is my son, the chosen, listen to him." But we know not always. In the valley, in the everyday, in the broken, we do sometimes have trouble finding that fullness of Jesus. His light can seem hidden, even lost. And the light that we receive from him, the fullness of light that he's given to each of you, to everyone here, the light that we remember in this flickering flame of the Christ candle, the one that we lit your baptismal candles off of, right? We struggle to see that light, but it's there. And we need each other. We need our community to remind us of what we've witnessed in our mountaintop moments. And so we gather for worship. We gather together to pray, and we study, and we sing, and we encourage. We go back up the mountain. And we don't just see Jesus as he truly is, but we also see ourselves as God sees us, as we truly are. Called to see ourselves differently, called to see the world differently. It's tempting to want to leave Jesus up on that mountain, to not want him down in those valley places, the broken places. It's tempting to forget the light that Jesus gives to us, the light that you all shine into the world. But Jesus isn't reserved for the mountaintop. He walks straight back down into the valley. He's the one who leads the disciples back off the mountain. He comes down to where we live. All the broken places and people, all the suffering and injustice, these are the places in the world and in us that Jesus has come to transfigure. And so his healing hands are nailed to a cross, and his dazzling white garments are stained with blood, and he travels down below the valley, beyond the valley, into death. But then, by his resurrection, even death itself is transfigured. So today in our worship, we have come to this mountaintop, and here Jesus is revealed to us in the word, in the wine, in the bread, in the sisters and brothers that we have surrounding us. And I look out at all of you, especially at the 4 of you, fittingly dressed in white, and this place is dazzling. So soon we will be sent back down the mountain to live and to love and to serve the people and the places that are in need of Jesus, in need of his transfiguration. And we'll go out with a vision, the after image of Jesus, shining brightly, dazzling, because we have witnessed it. We have seen it can be so. We trust it will be so. It is so. We go down the mountain and we proclaim what we have seen with just one little simple phrase. The Lord be with you. Amen.